May 19th, 1836. Fort Parker, Texas. The morning started like any other spring day. Women prepared breakfast while children played near the fort walls. Nobody noticed the dust rising in the distance until it was too late. Over 600 Comanche warriors surrounded Fort Parker before the settlers could close the gates. Rachel Plummer was 21 years old. She had her infant son, James, in her arms when the raiders broke through. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life, even after she finally returned home 21 months later. "They took us," Rachel later wrote in her memoir. "They took the women and children and left behind scenes I cannot describe even now." 5 captives were taken that day. Among them was 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, Rachel's cousin. Their fates would be completely different, their stories becoming symbols of the complex and tragic reality of captivity on the American frontier. The journey into darkness, Rachel's captivity, began with violence that 19th century newspapers refused to print. She was beaten repeatedly, forced to march hundreds of miles while still recovering from childbirth, carrying her infant son. The Comanche women in the group treated her with particular cruelty, seeing her as an outsider and enemy. "I was kicked, beaten with sticks, and dragged by my hair," Rachel documented. "My baby cried constantly from hunger, for I had no way to feed him properly during those endless days of travel." After 6 months of captivity, Rachel's son was taken from her and sold to a different tribe. She never saw him again. The loss broke something fundamental inside her, a grief so profound that even after her eventual rescue, she could barely speak of it. Rachel's treatment was not unusual. Historical records show that captive women often faced the harshest treatment from other women in the tribe, who saw them as competitors for resources and potential threats to tribal cohesion. The blue tattoos that told a story. 15 years after Fort Parker, another tragedy unfolded in the Arizona desert. The Oatman family was traveling to California in 1851 when they were attacked. Olive Oatman was 13 years old when she watched her parents and 4 siblings murdered before her eyes. Only Olive and her sister Mary Ann survived the initial attack. They were taken by the Yavapai tribe and marched into captivity. Mary Ann was younger, more fragile. The harsh conditions and inadequate food took their toll quickly. "Mary Ann grew thinner each day," Olive later recalled. "I watched my little sister fade like a candle burning down. I begged for food, for water, for anything to save her, but there was so little to give." Mary Ann died of starvation after a year in captivity. Olive was then traded to the Mojave tribe, who treated her somewhat better. The Mojave gave Olive distinctive blue tattoos on her chin, marking her as one of their own. These marks would identify her for the rest of her life. When Olive was finally rescued 5 years after her capture, those tattoos became both her proof of survival and her permanent stigma. She could never escape what had happened to her. Her face told the story she sometimes wished she could forget. Newspapers of the era sensationalized her story, but often left out the most painful details. The tattoos fascinated the public, but few understood what they really represented. Years of trauma, the loss of her entire family, and survival through unimaginable circumstances. The Council House massacre. Not all captives stayed in captivity for years. Some were used as bargaining tools in negotiations between tribes and settlers, but these negotiations sometimes went horribly wrong. March 19th, 1840. San Antonio, Texas. Comanche chiefs arrived at the council house to negotiate peace and discuss the return of captives. They brought one captive with them, Matilda Lockhart. What happened when Matilda walked into that room changed everything. Matilda had been captured as a teenager. When she appeared before the Texas officials, they were horrified. Her nose had been burned off. Her face was covered in bruises and scars. Parts of her body showed signs of repeated torture and abuse. She was disfigured beyond recognition, one witness reported. The sight of this poor woman destroyed any possibility of peaceful negotiation that day. The Texas officials, enraged by Matilda's condition, demanded the immediate return of all captives. The Comanche chiefs claimed they had no others. Tensions exploded, Fighting broke out in the council house. By the end of the day, dozens lay dead on both sides. The incident became known as the Council House Massacre, and it intensified the brutal cycle of violence between settlers and Comanche. Matilda's suffering became a rallying cry for revenge. Her tortured body turned into a political symbol rather than a person. Matilda survived the physical trauma but died less than a year later. Some historians believe she died from complications of her injuries. Others suggest she simply lost the will to continue living after everything she had endured. The girl who became Comanche. While Rachel Plummer fought to return home and Olive Oatman bore the marks of her captivity, young Cynthia Ann Parker disappeared into Comanche life completely. Cynthia was 9 years old at Fort Parker. By the time rescuers found her 24 years later, she had become Nadua, a Comanche woman, wife of a war chief, and mother of 3 children. She has forgotten English, reported the Texas Rangers who captured her in 1860. She refuses to answer to her Christian name. She cries constantly and tries to escape. This is History 12, where powerful stories of history come to life. If you enjoy real and impactful stories, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with others. Cynthia Ann had married Peter Nocona, a respected Comanche chief. She had children, including a son named Quanah, who would later become the last great chief of the Comanche. Her life among the Comanche was not captivity in the traditional sense. It had become her real life. But Texas officials saw her as a white woman who needed saving. They took her from her Comanche family by force, calling it a rescue. They brought her back to her blood relatives, people she barely remembered and could no longer communicate with. She is inconsolable, her uncle wrote. She mourns for her Comanche children more deeply than she ever rejoiced at her rescue. We saved her body but destroyed her spirit. Cynthia Ann repeatedly tried to escape and return to her Comanche family. Her daughter, Prairie Flower, taken with her, died of illness. The loss shattered what remained of Cynthia Ann's will. She stopped eating properly, stopped communicating, stopped living in any meaningful way. She died in 1870, most historians believe, from a broken heart and self-starvation. Her rescue had killed her more effectively than captivity ever had. The complexity of survival. These stories reveal uncomfortable truths about frontier captivity. The reality was far more complex than simple narratives of civilized versus savage could capture. Some captive women, like Rachel Plummer, endured brutal treatment and fought desperately to return home. Their testimonies documented genuine suffering and trauma. Others, like Cynthia Ann Parker, fully integrated into tribal life. Their captivity transformed into genuine belonging. Being rescued became its own trauma. Olive Oatman's experience fell somewhere in between. She returned to white society, but carried the permanent marks of her time with the Mojave. She spent the rest of her life caught between 2 worlds, never fully comfortable in either. What the newspapers wouldn't print. 19th century newspapers loved these stories but heavily censored them. They published enough to titillate readers but avoided details that might complicate the narrative or seem too disturbing for polite society. Rachel Plummer's complete memoir was considered too graphic for publication in its original form. Editors removed descriptions of violence, sexual assault, and the treatment of captive women. They wanted heroes and villains, not the messy reality of survival. The newspapers rarely mentioned that some women chose not to return when given the opportunity. They didn't discuss the children born to captive women and what happened to those children. They avoided the question of how white society treated returning captives. Women who returned from captivity often faced suspicion and social stigma. Their marriageability was questioned. Their virtue was doubted. Some communities welcomed them back. Others treated them as contaminated outsiders. Better to die than be taken was common advice given to frontier women. This reflected not just fear of captivity conditions, but fear of how they would be treated if they survived and returned. The children of 2 worlds. Children born to captive women existed in a particularly painful limbo. Many were forcibly separated from their mothers when rescue came. Others were left behind entirely when women returned to white society. Cynthia Ann Parker's son Gwynne was not captured with his mother. He grew up as a Comanche warrior, later becoming chief. After the Comanche Wars ended, Gwynne successfully navigated both native and white worlds, becoming wealthy and respected. But Gwynne spent his entire adult life trying to find his mother's grave and bring her remains back to Comanche territory. He succeeded only near the end of his own life, finally reuniting his mother with the people she had chosen. Rachel Plummer's son, James Pratt Plummer, was traded multiple times between tribes. He was eventually ransomed, but he was so young when taken that he had no memory of his mother or original identity. The reunion brought joy to Rachel, but confusion to her son, who had to learn an entirely new culture and language. The photograph that captured everything. One photograph summarizes these complex stories better than words can. It shows Olive Oatman late in life, her chin tattoos clearly visible, her eyes containing depths of experience that the camera couldn't fully capture. She's dressed in Victorian fashion, her hair styled according to white society's standards. But those blue marks on her face tell a different story. They mark her as someone who survived something most people couldn't imagine, who lived between worlds, who carried her history on her skin. Olive spent years giving lectures about her experiences. She married and tried to build a normal life, but she never escaped those tattoos, never stopped being the girl who lived with the Indians. Near the end of her life, Olive became quieter about her experiences. Perhaps she tired of being a curiosity. Perhaps the memories became too painful to constantly revisit. She died in Texas in 1903, taking many of her truest thoughts and feelings with her. The legacy of pain. These women's stories matter because they reveal truths about the American frontier that comfortable myths ignore. The West wasn't just cowboys and pioneers conquering wilderness. It was also trauma, cultural collision, violence that destroyed lives on all sides. Rachel Plummer's suffering was real and documented. Her testimony provides crucial historical evidence about captivity conditions and treatment. Matilda Lockhart's torture demonstrated the worst possibilities of frontier conflict, but her story was also weaponized by those seeking justification for violence against native peoples. Cynthia Ann Parker's forced rescue proves that good intentions don't always produce good outcomes. Sometimes saving someone means destroying them. Olive Oatman's permanent tattoos remind us that some experiences mark us forever, physically and emotionally. Survival doesn't mean unscathed. Why we must remember, modern America often prefers simpler stories about the past. We want clear heroes and villains. We want happy endings. We want to believe that rescue always means salvation. These women's actual experiences challenge those comfortable narratives. They force us to grapple with complexity, to acknowledge that history contains no simple moral lessons, only human beings trying to survive impossible circumstances. Their stories also remind us that women's experiences in history deserve serious examination, not sensationalism or censorship. For too long, these accounts were either exaggerated for entertainment or suppressed as too disturbing for public consumption. Rachel, Matilda, Cynthia Ann, and Olive were real people. They lived, suffered, loved, and endured. They made impossible choices in circumstances no one should face. They survived, or didn't survive, the collision of cultures that characterized the American frontier. The questions that remain: what do we owe these women's memories? How do we tell their stories truthfully while honoring their humanity? How do we acknowledge the genuine suffering many experienced while also recognizing that simple victim narratives don't capture the full reality? These questions have no easy answers, but asking them matters. Sitting with the discomfort matters. Refusing to reduce these women's complex lives to simple morality tales matters. The American West was built on many foundations, and among them were the broken and resilient bodies of women like Rachel, Matilda, Cynthia Ann, and Olive. Their stories aren't just history, They're evidence of human capacity for both cruelty and survival, destruction and adaptation. We remember them not to judge their choices or their captors, but to witness their experiences honestly. They deserve that much, at minimum. They deserve to be more than footnotes or symbols. They deserve to be seen as fully human, with all the complexity that entails. Their silence should not equal our forgetting. Their pain should not be exploited for entertainment. Their lives should be honored with truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. This is their legacy. The unspeakable reality they lived, documented as much as possible, remembered as completely as we can manage, honored with the complexity they deserve. Thank you for watching.